first speaker today is Dr. Neal Carter. He is a native Floridian, so that makes him rare indeed. Still calls Florida his home. He's a husband to a wife of 31 years, Lynette, and father to Jonathan and Stephanie, 26 and 19. I don't know if they like that being broadcast, but it is now. So he's currently employed at the Florida Department of Corrections as a regional mental health ombudsman, providing oversight and advocacy for the severely and persistently mentally ill in prison forensic hospital settings across Central Florida. Prior to that, he was employed with FDC for over 20 years in various mental health positions. He was a faculty member with the APA doctoral internship, which was the first kind in the country, so that's pretty exciting. We've got preeminence among us. Specializing in areas that you all might be interested in: crisis intervention, hostage negotiation, risk management of violence, and as the institutional mental health director for a 180-bed psychiatric hospital within the prison system. You think you might have a question for him? You might be interested in what he has to say? Since graduating from FSU, he's taught part-time and works as an assistant professor and a faculty advisor in an online program at Liberty University, and also an online adjunct at Columbia College in Columbia, Missouri. He's a busy guy, but with no further ado, please welcome Dr. Neal Carter.
It is quite an honor and a joy to be participating in this colloquium with all of you. The opportunity to come back and see my wife and I have driven through the campus a couple times over the years, visiting, going to football games, what have you. But the campus is very different from what I remember. Roads that no longer go through places, dead ends, new buildings. It's almost like a different university. But I truly appreciate the opportunity to come and share some of my experience with you guys this morning. We had a wonderful time last night at the reception. I got to meet Sarah and Rebecca, Dr. Cottingham's daughters. That was a real treat. I didn't know Dr. Cottingham. He passed away probably about 6 years before I came into the department in '87. But his legacy, even back in '87, was obvious in terms of how he was discussed, his contributions to the program, and so his legacy has been strong throughout the time that my association with our department. So I want to kind of give you a preview of some of the things that I want to kind of talk about with you this morning. I don't have any slides. I'm kind of an informal kind of guy, so I'm going to share with you some of my career path in terms of what got me into the prison system to begin with, because it certainly was not a planned journey. And it will become more apparent as I share with you some of my path. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the prison system, the state prison system here in Florida, some of the challenges, some of the benefits of working in a program or in a department such as that. And so that's kind of be the development of my contribution this morning. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't start out by giving you some of my favorite stories from my experience here. And I'll start out with my best one. And then it probably goes downhill from there. So you guys remember, I don't know if some of the younger students would remember, but there was a place called Nicholson Farmhouse out in Havana. You remember that? So it was a place where folks from Tallahassee would go to get a nice meal out in the country, very rustic, very, very cool place to go to. So the night before I graduate, and this is in December of 1993, my family, my wife's family, Bob, we're all gathered around this large table, and I'm just nervous as a cat. Not only do I not get my wife's family and my family together, but they also meet Bob, who was such an instrumental part in my development over the last in those previous 5 years. So we're sitting there, and I'm just kind of, taking it all in, and all of a sudden Bob leans over to me, and my father-in-law is directly across the table from me, and Bob leans over and he goes, in times of revolution, they come for the academics first. So I'm sitting there and I think about it. I think, that would have been a great thing to lead with back in '87 when I applied, because my decision might have been quite different had I known that, I was on the firing line in times of revolution. So that was one of the highlights of the graduate weekend, because it was a really funny story. Last night at the reception, Bob shared with me there's at least one student, and I hope she's here. I hadn't planned on sharing this story, but there's at least one student here that has had some technical issues with perhaps a dissertation. You don't have to self-identify. He asked me if I was going to share this story. I hadn't planned on it, but I will. So back in '87, when I got to town, one of the first things we did was purchase a computer. Now, you have to understand, back in '87, computers were quite different, obviously, than they are today. I mean, it's hard to think that just in a short time how much it's progressed. So we purchased a computer, and I use it for my word processing throughout. What I didn't know at the time was that it was a program that was unique to that system, and it couldn't speak to other word processing programs. So I'm writing my dissertation towards the latter part of my stay, and I get to the point where I have it all on disk, and my computer broke, and I couldn't print off my dissertation. Now, I had dissertations hidden everywhere. I had it on a disk. I had one in the refrigerator. I had one, just in case the house burned down or something. So I'm not a type A paranoid guy by history, but I was about this. And I get to the point where I'm ready to print it off, and I put it in another system, and it won't print. And I'm panicking. I'm thinking, what the heck am I going to do? And by this time, I'd finished my internship at Memphis State, and we had come back to Orlando. I had started working for a psychologist in Winter Park, and that's another part of this journey I'll share in a minute, thinking that I wanted to be in private practice. Where have you heard that before, right? And so I was beside myself. No dissertation, no graduation. What in the heck am I going to do? So I found this guy who did computers out of his home. If you ask me today how I found him, I have no clue. But he was able to take the disk and somehow read it and make it happen, and I paid $1 a page, so I paid about $140 to get my dissertation printed out. Little did he know, I would have probably paid $5 a page. I would have paid anything to get that thing printed out. So I understand there's one among you who are also having some technical problems, maybe with technology, so my heart goes out to you. So let me start by talking a little bit about my own career path and how this whole correctional psychology thing started with me. So one of the things that I didn't want to do, that I knew for certain that I didn't want to do in my undergrad, because I got an undergrad in psychology and a master's in psychology, one of the things I was certain I didn't want to do was work with severely and persistently mentally ill patients. That was one thing that I was absolutely certain of. I even had an opportunity in my undergrad to do an internship at a inpatient mental health facility in Knoxville. Didn't want anything to do with it. Graduated, moved back to Clearwater, had a difficult time finding a job. First job I had paid $9,500 working for the Salvation Army. Now this is undergrad, working as a probation officer. Moved up, started working for the state as a probation officer. So my correctional experience actually started prior to, during the time I was getting my master's degree, but certainly before coming to Florida State. The ironic part of that is I didn't anticipate that once I left that part of my work life behind, that it would ever come back. When I finished in the fall of '87 with my quit my job. My wife and I sold our house. We moved, sold everything, moved up here to start a new journey. I thought corrections was in my rearview window. Had no idea. Never even thought about it again. So I came up here, got introduced to career and vocational counseling, spent some time in the Career Center. Somehow, some way, just kind of naturally gravitated towards that. Especially the idea that students and community entering into a career center seeking assistance was a more simple pathway for those who maybe had deeper psychological and mental health issues, and it was a safer way to come in and ask for assistance. And that part of it kind of intrigued me. But the important thing to take out all of that is that corrections wasn't even anywhere in my wish list. So I went through the program, did an internship at Memphis State, which is now University of Memphis, had a wonderful experience there. Wonderful supervision. It was the highlight of my actual hands-on training. Even thought about the idea of working in a university counseling center until I saw how much they paid. Not that money was the primary issue, but I couldn't at that point see myself going down that road. Little did I know that working as a state employee for 20-something years wasn't going to pay me a lot of money anyway, so it ended up not being a primary factor. So as a lot of folks in my program, and there were 7 of us that started, a lot of us kind of had aspirations of working in private practice. I'm sure there aren't any of you like that in the audience, right? So once I finished with my internship, moved back down, finished up some loose ends on my dissertation, then moved to Winter Park where I did my pre-doc and worked with a psychologist there in that city. Little did I know that my life was going to turn around. Shortly after I finished my pre-doc with him, I was exploring my options, whether to stay in that clinic, whether to move out, do something else, but he was certainly still a big part of my training and supervision. At 48, he dropped dead in his front yard, landscaping his garden. And I got a phone call, said, and this was his wife that called me and said, Dennis died. He had a heart attack over the weekend. Okay, well, now what do I do? Kind of selfishly, obviously, after feeling bad for Dennis. But at 48, you don't expect that to happen, but it did. So I've always had my hand in teaching. So I was teaching almost immediately after graduating from the program at local schools and local colleges and universities, and that's been a part of kind of a secondary career all along. So trying to kind of figure out what the heck I was going to do, and I was looking at some different job postings, came across a job in corrections, and I said, that sounds familiar. I can do that. I've worked with probationers. Wonder what that would be like. The salary was more than I had ever seen in my life, $45,000. That was a ton of money for me. And I had a young child. We were just trying to start out. I was eager to get on my journey, and went for an interview at the facility that I'm at now, and didn't know it, but whether you call it God's providence, whether you call it serendipity, I probably call it a little bit of both. At this facility, they were building, and they just had the first floor finished, a 2-story psychiatric hospital, which was going to be the biggest of its kind in our state system. And I just happened to be hired 6 months before they opened. And I thought, wow, no one else wanted to work inpatient. Now remember, back in my undergrad, I wanted no part of working with severely and persistently mentally ill either. But that was then, this is now. And I'm thinking, I'm not always quick on the draw, but I'm thinking, okay, this could be pretty plumb. I get a chance to start a program from scratch. I can hire all my own people. How many opportunities do you have to do that in your career? And I thought, I can do this. So I volunteered, and I said, I'll do the inpatient. I had no inpatient experience whatsoever. So I was smart enough, at least at that point, to hire folks that were working with me and for me who had worked in inpatient facilities. And most of the hires turned out to be wonderful, and they stuck there for 10, 12 years and were instrumental in getting that program up and running. So worked in a variety of positions, started in 1996. Started out as a psychologist, then a senior psychologist. The first floor, this is a 180-bed facility, and we had inmates from all over the state, and I'll describe the system in a minute. They would come from all the facilities in the state for inpatient mental health treatment. Then we adopted or got the involuntary treatment program, which came over from another institution because of some difficulties that they were having providing treatment. Now, this would be analogous in our community system to a Baker Act facility, if you guys understand the civil commitment rules. So we had an involuntary treatment facility within our inpatient program, and that was an added experience in terms of education of dealing with those who were receiving involuntary treatment. So all along the way, the journey of being a correctional psychologist started to diversify. I started to work not only as a senior, but I worked as a director for a couple of years. But one thing you need to know about the state system, and this is probably true of a lot of bureaucracies, I'd assume, but certainly I can speak from experience working in the correctional system. My frustrations, my challenges have almost invariably not come from working with inmates. You know what you're getting into when you've worked for a period of time with inmates. There are some that have secondary gain issues for wanting mental health treatment. They can be manipulative. They certainly have their share of personality disorders. But you know what you're getting. You know what you're getting into. One thing that I didn't expect was the challenge of working in a bureaucracy whose challenge, it seemed, on a day-to-day basis was to pick those things that would absolutely make your job harder and do it. Almost as if they were reading your mind and said, boy, if only this doesn't happen, I'll be okay. The next day, this happens. So the challenge of working in a correctional system, probably, at least in my experience, has been going in with eyes wide open, understanding and knowing that if you're going to call this a career, and for me it has been a calling, truly, because I wouldn't have stayed there, because I've toyed several times with moving on to other jobs in the community, even moving to North Carolina at a time probably at the lowest in my career, where I was having some difficulties with some of the bureaucracy, and actually geographically moved from the prison that I've been at more than 20 years to another facility just to kind of get out of harm's way, lick my wounds, survive another day. And it was at that time that I thought, I'm going to explore. I actually went up to North Carolina, where my wife and I vacation every year. We love the mountains. Interviewed at 2 facilities for a director position, got both jobs, came home, and my wife said, you need to stay put. You need to ride this thing out. And I trust her judgment implicitly. She's been through everything that I've been through, and she's got a unique problem-solving ability that I don't have, honestly, to be able to separate emotion from fact. And she turned out to give me the best piece of advice, which was just to stick it out, because otherwise I'd probably be in North Carolina right now. So I did, and it turned out to be a wonderful decision. Around that time, I'm talking about 2009 or so, 2010, we started to hear rumors about privatization. And certainly Florida wasn't the first state system or even local system that had talked about privatizing health care. It had always been in the background as a rumor. Well, it stopped becoming a rumor. And our system, our health services system, not just mental health, but physical health, dental, mental health, everything. Talking about 2,400 employees became privatized overnight and changed our system immediately. There's a text that I teach from in my abnormal psychology class that I teach that harkens back to Bedlam Hospital over in Europe, where they first started to treat the mentally ill en masse. And one of the comments that the authors makes was, one of the worst things that you can do, and boy, this, talking about full circle, one of the worst things you can do is put somebody who's in charge of a system providing health care for profit and put it behind a fence where people can't access and have oversight about what's happening. And you're doing it for profit. Because what's going to happen? Where are they going to make their profit? Where are they going to make their money? Well, you only have a couple things you can cut. You can only cut services, you can only cut staff, you can cut overhead. All those things were cut. That's why about 2 or 3 years into this privatization experience, they started toying around with the position that I'm in now, which is a mental health ombudsman. And it's one of only 2 programs in the country, at least in a state system that I'm familiar with, where you have a private vendor, but a state employee as a independent advocate, observer, oversight function, who comes in and every day has access to everything that you need to be able to access to ascertain the health of the program. Charts, multidisciplinary treatment meetings, wardens meetings, all of the things that are inherent with kind of taking the temperature of a particular program or treatment program. And I get involved in all of that. So basically my job on a daily basis, and I've been at this job now since 2015, and there are 4 of us positioned at the highest profile inpatient units around the state, and mine happens to be at the facility where I've spent most of my time. And then we have a state ombudsman who kind of oversees our activities. We operate independently. But my job on a daily basis is to provide advocacy for, first and foremost, to make sure that inmates' mental health care concerns are taken care of in accordance with policy and procedure. That's the important distinction. I can't just make a decision that I think something needs to happen if it's outside of policy. So it has to be policy driven. That's true of any bureaucracy. In addition to advocating, I will at times also direct treatment. Very seldom do I have to do that, but I'll give you an example. My first week doing this job, and this is May of 2015, I'm walking the unit and I see a lot of inmates that I've been a part of their treatment for many, many years prior to that. I recognize a lot of faces. And that comes just with being in a position for a long enough time where you see a lot of folks come and go. And so I'm walking a unit, and I turn, and there is an inmate that I know very well, and he says, "Dr. Carter, I want to show you something." And I'll never forget this. I walk over there, and he takes his tongue and presses it up against his cheek, like that, and this wound opens up. And it's probably about that deep. And he says, "I've had this since Friday. So now Saturday's gone, Sunday's gone, Monday's gone. This is Tuesday, 4 days later. And this guy's sitting there with an open, gaping wound, and nothing's been done." So I start looking at charts, I start asking questions, I start going to treatment team providers, particularly the medical services that provide the medical care in our building. And it was kind of, I got a lot of that. So no accountability, no responsibility. And so that was kind of the first insight I had about what kind of a challenge this job was going to be, at least on the front end. Now, I will say, fast forward 3 years, that things have got better, but my job still exists, so that tells you something. So let me tell you about, you may have questions about some of the things that I've just talked about, and that's during the panel discussion. So I'm not covering everything, and so those specific questions that you have, I know you'll feel free to ask those once we get into the panel format. So the next part of what I want to kind of talk with you guys about is recent developments that have, and I think I've probably already mentioned some of this, that have not only created my position, but made what I do and made the provision of mental health services and healthcare overall such an important aspect of what's happening in our state system. So right now we're under pending litigation, and there are some very public cases that some of you guys may have read about in the paper, starting with an inmate at another facility who died by suspicious causes. So as part of that litigation, obviously my job was created. And so part of what I'm doing now in the context of litigation is becoming more involved with chart audits, with reporting back to particular stakeholders, both on the private side and on the state side, and having larger discussions about what needs to change in our system policy-wise, and also in terms of the feet on the ground decisions to make sure that these issues that have come up in litigation are dealt with and addressed. So part of the reward, or part of the most rewarding aspects of what I have done over the years, and just looking back over my career, and as I think about it and focus on the things that have brought me the most satisfaction, because as I mentioned earlier on, this is really about a calling for me. I probably would not have stayed, in fact I'm certain I would not have stayed in this career had it not been something that I felt was larger than just the money or the position or a job. And there have been plenty that have come and gone. And I was talking to Jim last night, Jim Sampson, and he talked about the last position that he had before he retired. And I could identify very closely with what he said. And he said, it was sort of like I was the last man standing. I was the one that had been around the most, or been around the longest, had all this institutional knowledge. And okay, so you're doing it. So it was, at times it feels like that, you know, a lot of your colleagues over the years have kind of fallen by the wayside. Some have retired, some have gone on to other things. The grass is not always greener, by the way, no matter how bad you think you have it now. But sort of like the last man standing mentality, having survived the institutional ups and downs and the bureaucratic ups and downs, have put me in a position, positive or negative, that I'm in now. But as I think back, getting back to some of the things that have been most rewarding, the thing that comes to mind the most is the mentoring and training. One of the things that I learned early on as I started to figure out how to hire people, because it's not something that you learn in this program or any graduate program for that matter, how to do the personnel side of it, how to hire people, what you look for. And so what I did is I used my teaching to my advantage. I had students in the community at a master's program that I knew well, and I focused on hiring younger master's students who were just out of their program, whom I could honestly train and not have to worry about 10 or 15 or 20 years of institutional baggage and having them unlearn that. because I'll tell you that doesn't happen. You know, if someone's been in the system long enough, no matter what they tell you, they're going to be very resistant. And I didn't need that headache early on. So part of the reward of working in this system for as long as I have is the ability to mentor and train younger professionals just coming into the field and helping them to acclimate to a system that, quite honestly, is quite quite negative towards mental health services at times. It differs from institution to institution, and sometimes you do get wonderful administrative staff who understand the need for mental health services. But on the other hand, you also have the other end of the spectrum, where working in a prison system can be unbelievably challenging. And as you just think about now, regardless of what training that you're in or what level you're at, think about the perfect environment where you want to see and provide services to clients. And a prison setting probably isn't at the top of your list of where you would want to provide these services. It's just not what you think of when you think about the environment where you might be providing services. So the ability to be on the early end of that training and mentoring, helping them to acclimate in terms of what's normal, in terms of comparing their educational experience with what life is like working in a prison setting, has been tremendously rewarding. Just for an example, no one had even thought about videotaping supervision. And so we started instituting some of that. This was years ago. And it caused quite a ruckus. You know, wardens didn't understand why we were doing it. You know, the whole idea of videotaping something and how that videotape would be used. And of course, we went through all the disclosures and how the tape would be used, when would it be destroyed. But for supervision purposes, that was something that the student was used to in their educational and training programs that I could start bringing into their workplace that would help ease that transition and make it a more of a clinical program than perhaps it would have been without an experience like that. Building a climate of advocacy, even early on. Now, I had no thought that this position was in my future. But like I tell the private vendors now, even though I'm in a position that has that title, all of you are advocates for your clients. Now, in a prison setting, that comes with some trials and tribulations. And by that, I mean that not everyone is going to be as passionate about your advocacy as you might hope, even within your own discipline. Not to mention security and working with other disciplines who only see inmates in one particular way. But no matter what setting you're in, whether you're in a community setting, whether you're in private practice, whether you're working in a college counseling center, and certainly if you're in a prison setting, you're always an advocate for your clients. It's part of our social justice mandate, regardless of what the dilemma or the issue is, that you as the counselor, you as the primary provider, have an obligation to make sure that the services that they need, if they don't exist, that you are loud and proud about what the need is and be instrumental in voicing that. You may not always get the outcome that you desire, but it's so necessary to be an advocate. And in a prison setting, sometimes the negative consequences that are associated with that come in passive-aggressive responses, particularly from the security side. Because, and you guys may have experienced this too, but working in an inpatient setting, nothing happens without the ability for security to take inmate patients out for you to provide services. And if they slow play you, if they refuse to take inmates out, or say, I'll get to it in a minute, and never do, that can make your job, your life, very, very frustrating in terms of accessing inmate patients to see. Or you can be smart and spend time educating and talking to and developing collaborative relationships with those disciplines who may be very, at least initially, very negative about providing services. But I can't tell you the number of times working with security staff over the years that they have, I can remember one sergeant in particular who in a training session, he had worked in the inpatient mental health unit with me for 6 or 7 years. and was, at least at that point from my perspective, a very positive influence on the inmates. He stood up in a training meeting once and said, I just don't think that mental health issues exist. These are all game players. These are all manipulators. And I'm thinking to myself, Sarge, you've seen what I've seen for 6 years. How do you explain some of the self-injurious behavior, some of the suicide attempts, some of the actual suicides? How do you explain that? Well, I grant you that it's hard sometimes to figure it all out, but I just don't think that these guys need to be here. A year later, he comes to me, and he's changing his tune. And the reason he was doing that is because he had personal experience now. His daughter ended up having to go for mental health services, and now it hit home. Now it was personal. And I can't tell you the number of times where minds have changed once it becomes personal for them. Coming to me and say, hey, Doc, I'm not a psychiatrist. I know just by default and exposures know enough about medication to make me dangerous. So they'll come and say, Doc, what do you think about this medication? I'm not a psychiatrist. I can't tell you. I know what it's for. Well, I went to I've been feeling X, Y, and Z, and I'm starting to take this medication now. What do you think? And so we'd have a discussion. Now, all of a sudden, again, the problems became real because it was personal. It's unfortunate that that's what it takes sometimes for a mind to change. Because if that were true, I'd put all the officers on medications and they would, it would make my life a lot easier. The third thing I would think that has meant so much to me, and then got a couple more things and I'll close up, is the ability to work kind of dovetailing a little bit of about what I just said, and that is developing collaborative relationships with disciplines who had previously had no thought of providing mental health services. Because in an inpatient setting, security is actually a member, at least in our system, a working member of our multidisciplinary teams, because they have to provide security in the meetings, in some instances because of inmate risk of violence. And so because they have exposure to that information, they actually are a working member of our teams. And getting them to a point where they can start working collaboratively with us, and it takes a lot of hard work for a very long time with some of the same staff to actually break down some of those defenses and some of those obstacles that I just got through talking about with security. And when you start seeing it pay off, when you see it come to fruition where they are actually participating members and actually have comments, unsolicited, that, hey, this guy's struggling a little bit, this guy's having some problems. You might want to go see this guy again. That part is very rewarding, although the rewards are very delayed. And I guess the last thing would be, for me, and I've mentioned this a couple times, but I do think it's important for you guys to know. How many of you, let me just do a little quick experiment. And this is why correctional psychology is so important. Everybody stand up for a minute. Okay, so I want everybody to remain standing except Janet for your row. You guys stay standing. Everyone else sit. The thing that makes correctional psychology so important is that if the 100 or so people that are here right now are our sample size for those that are currently in prison, everyone sitting down is eventually getting out. 95% of the inmates in our state and federal systems eventually get released back to the community. Correctional psychology is important if for no other reason. You guys can sit, thank you. It was actually an experiment for you guys. I wanted to see how long you would stand. If for no other reason, correctional psychology is important because they're our neighbors. We're interacting with them in our neighborhoods, in places of business, in theme parks, in a number of settings. And wouldn't you rather, take your counselor hat off for a minute and just think about yourself as a citizen in the community. Wouldn't you rather have some of those 95% that are coming out of prison, wouldn't you rather have those that are mentally ill? And it's about, the stat is about 18%. It kind of mirrors what's in the community now. 18% of our mental health of our inmate population are receiving mental health services. So in our state system, that's about 18,000 inmates that are receiving some level of mental health services. Wouldn't you sleep better at night knowing that of that population, those 18% are getting some mental health treatment that has been meaningful, that they come out on medications if they need it, those that are severely and persistently mentally ill, that without their medications are unstable and put themselves in situations where they can get rearrested or in small numbers of cases become violent. Nationwide, we have about 650,000 inmates a year that get released. 650,000 in our state and federal system. That's a lot of inmates. If you add the county jails, now you're talking about multi-millions because their transition in county jails is very quick, in and out, for the most part. We need good folks to work in our correctional system that view it as a calling, that view it as something that regardless of the obstacles, you're coming in to do the right thing, and you're there not because of the money, you're not there not just because it's a paycheck, you're not there just because it's a job, but you're there because you recognize the need, and even in your little corner of the world, you can impact one person at a time. And if everyone did that, who wanted to work in a correctional setting, imagine the impact we could make. So that's what makes this conference so important. And I don't know how many of you are here just because the idea of correctional psychology is so novel, or it's maybe something that you've been considering, or maybe after we're done today, it's on your list of careers to consider. Regardless of which category you're in, my advocacy for you guys would be that for those of you that are interested, that you do it for the right reasons. Because as I was telling one of the professors here earlier this morning, if you're in it and you can get hired right now with the private concerns and come out making almost $100,000 a year. Sounds pretty awesome. It is awesome. I'd like to have some of that. But you won't last very long if all it is a paycheck. It's got to mean more to you than just what your bank account shows. Thank you guys for your attention.